The many skyscrapers of New York City, the incredible, impeccable megalopolis on the east coast of the United States, a city that happens to be situated on the world's largest natural harbor, or at least one of the world's largest natural harbors. And when we look at it, we see a eclectic mix of modern structures with old world structures, and of course with our great glass and steel towers that reach to the sky. Although I have to say they're certainly not locations I would seek refuge in the event of any sort of natural disaster. What's really the account, though, with New York City? Why is it this impressive megalopolis of 8 million people with 5 distinct boroughs grew up in a very short amount of time? What's its significance for understanding the old world and the principles of the theories with the concept of Tartaria and the civilization that preceded ours? How is it that New York City is a nexus point? Why do we have so many different incredible structures? And everyone who resides in New York City or visits always comes across the sign that you are no doubt entering a true land of liberty. And make no mistakes about it, this is a land of liberty. Join me as we explore New York City, Reset Center 1. New York City's status as the largest natural harbor in the world, or at least one of the largest, is no doubt one of its main points to understand as to why this would be a great city. Indeed, it is still the greatest city in the United States, the most populous with over 8 million people, nearly 2 times the size of Los Angeles, or the City of the Angels, a very apt name for the city in Southern California. But how exactly did this come to be? Most people think of Manhattan when they think of New York City, although there are 5 distinct boroughs: Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and of course the often forgotten Staten Island. What was the origin of New York City? We understand that it was originally a Dutch settlement and Fort Amsterdam from the original maps. And yet, with our questioning of our official historical account, we have to wonder exactly what the origin was. Why is it this particular city constantly comes up as the center point for understanding the United States? There are many overlapping coincidences for what makes New York significant. Beyond the fact that it is the main port of entry, if you will, for the United States, always has been, and it seems like it always will be. The United Nations just happens to be headquartered within New York City. And it also has the status as being the financial capital of the entire land, or the world, however you want to say it. It's anchored by Wall Street in the financial district within Manhattan. It's considered the largest metropolitan economy in the world, and it also just happens to be the residence of the most billionaires at this time, and millionaires of any city within the world. How exactly, though, do we have this very unique history of the plan of New York City? And when we look at many of the early maps, whether it's the original layout map, and how anyone can know that, I always find that fascinating, of the Dutch settlement of Fort Amsterdam in the 1600s, and you may recall there was a TV show with Jamie Lannister himself called New Amsterdam. I can't say it was a very enjoyable one, but that's just my opinion. Looking, though, at these early maps, we have the impression, it seems, that New York City, much like every other city and town across the United States, seems to have had a very definitive plan. And when you look at the early maps, I'm oftentimes surprised by just how densely populated the city seems to have been, especially Manhattan Island itself. Now, is this just because of good urban planning from the very start? Certainly somebody saw that this was one of the world's largest natural harbors, and they knew that the city was going to have a very impeccable history behind it, even in the past. People were looking ahead, they were prescient in a way. Or is there an entirely different explanation for why we have these very elaborate maps that are incredibly detailed and seem to show planning with a density in terms of structures and even an existing infrastructure? Is it possible that New York City and its 5 boroughs were actually remnants or surviving portions of an old world entire city? And it could have in fact been the most intact. Because one of the things that we tend to overlook when we look at our historical account of the United States is, when exactly did we go through all the difficulty of constructing these cities and these towns? Official history tells us that most of the work was done in the 1800s. Virtually every city and town in the United States had the lion's share of the work of establishing its infrastructure. In other words, making a city or town self-sustaining. You need to have water, you need to have food, you need to have a well-developed logistics system. Ah, yes, logistics. That entire concept that we often hand wave away when we talk about how these incredible structures were built by a logistically limited society in the 1800s. Because as we understand it, there was horse and buggy, and to a lesser extent, there were trains. Oh, yes, that impressive train infrastructure system that seemed to be built very quickly and very rapidly. Now, maybe it happened as we thought, but going back to the theory of New York City being Reset Center 1, let's look at our population chart here. And we see that New York City became the largest city in the United States from 1790, a distinction it continues to this day. And it's also worth noting that even by the mid-1800s or 1850, when so many things all seem to just randomly begin, I'm sure that's another coincidence, the population was stated to be 500,000. There's also other interesting overlapping details about New York City. The entire orphan train program for the United States was facilitated through New York City. Again, the official history says there were just so many orphans running around New York City. Even though if you ever read into the history and understand the society at that time, it never made a lot of sense. Looking at New York City's evolving skyline, we understand that the first skyscrapers were constructed in the 1890s. It's also interesting to note that not many structures were really built all the way through the rest of the 20th century. In other words, the account we have seems to indicate that most of the skyscrapers were built in the early portion of the 20th century. And then once we got past the Great Depression, not too many structures were constructed. Yes, a few notable ones were, but it really wasn't until more recent times that we started building all these very impressive pencil skyscrapers. Now, I know it's all a matter of taste, and yes, I certainly don't want to denigrate the design plans of the new modern pencil skyscrapers, and they look so incredible. But when you look in the history of New York City, you see that it seems to have included many impressive structures that you wouldn't expect to see, such as these numerous armories, these incredible castles. And the reason I find this little detail very fascinating is that these armories have shown up in many cities all across the United States, and yes, they clearly look like castles. And the reason that they're stated to look like castles is because they were defensive fortifications for the militias at the time. And there were many militias that were required in New York City throughout its time frame and existence. But I'm also intrigued by the fact that they managed to build these impressive structures, and many of them do survive to this day. They include architectural detailings that seem to go beyond what we'd expect to see in a very densely packed city. And whether we're saying it's a densely compressed population or just simply dense urban structures that have a more vertical nature to them. And of course, if you live in New York City or you visit it to this day, that's one of the first things that you'll notice. It is very much a vertical existence. Even Los Angeles, despite the fact that it has about half the population of New York City, does not share its same vertical nature. And of course, it does not have its infrastructure in terms of having a subway. Yes, Los Angeles has a subway, but it's certainly nowhere near as extensive or as accessible as the subway in New York City, which you can ride to visit these very impressive armories that still exist in many places to this day. Now, who actually went to the effort, and how did they go about building these armories? The armories always interest me because of the fact that they are located in many unique areas. For example, you'll often find armories in the United States universities. For example, the armory at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. It's where their basketball team used to play their basketball games, and the building still exists to this day. You even remember the example at The Ohio State University with their impressive castle armory. And yet there are many castle armories, such as this one in New York City. Look at that nice M60 main battle tank out in front of it. Isn't that just a wonderful overlapping of history right there? But it really gives you the impression that there had to be something more than what we understand with the official history of New York City. Why are there all these castles? Why would anybody go to the trouble of building these castles that seem to be right in the middle of the city? If the desire was to defend the city, wouldn't you want to build the castles at least on the perimeter of the city? Oh no, we're going to build it right in the middle of the city. And of course you can try to explain it by saying, well, it was during the time of expansion. But yet we look at the earlier maps and the earlier plans, and it gives us the impression that this was already a built-out city, just looking at Manhattan Island, to say nothing of the other 4 boroughs. So what's really the history behind it? Why is it that we have these impressive towers with these very unique parapets where if one were so inclined, you could film your next Deathstalker movie and show the final duel between Deathstalker and Troxardus, such as on that tower there. Who exactly would go about building a tower like that just for an armory in the middle of the city anyway? Trying to consider all military applications for it doesn't make a lot of sense. Some of the interior images that we have of these armories are no less impressive. They show very large formation areas that have seats around them, so I guess people could watch the formations in the parades indoors. Imagine that. Well, I guess you always have your inclement weather plan available if you're going to do your final pass and review parade, if you are indeed a military formation. But there always seems to be a different number of explanations for how these structures could have been used, as though they could have had a variety of different purposes. Could this have once been a hangar of some sort? It almost looks like it was supposed to be a hangar, but maybe that's just my imagination running wild with me. And yet you'll see that same detail that's reflected in many of these armories, as though they were very ubiquitous, all over the city, and I'm just going to come out and say it, I have a theory that perhaps these armories were actually there, and older structures that were repurposed to be used by the new force that was occupying the city. And of course, we always have that same terminology, occupy this, occupy that. But if you think about this, whether you want to think of this as an early colonization, I always found it intriguing that the Dutch, despite the fact that they discovered and built the first fort, Fort Amsterdam, just decided to leave what is the greatest or one of the greatest natural harbors in the world. Well, I'm sure there's economic reasons behind it. That's always intriguing when you try to overlay all the economic mentality that comes around New York City to this day. You have the New York Stock Exchange, you have the NASDAQ, and everyone realizes that all the greatest financial transactions of the land occur in New York City. Officially, it's also one of the most international cities in the land, where you have 800 of the 7,000 to 9,000 languages in the land, depending on which sources you consult, spoken in one single city. And so its more international character is something that if you don't live in New York City, you don't interact with every day. And yet it's very much there. Deconflicted with the fact that we have all these armories. And so these details alone give us the impression that there is a lot to this theory that this really was Reset Center 1. That New York City, its entire infrastructure, and whatever name it originally had, and that's certainly not relevant now, were actually a series of surviving structures with the supporting infrastructure from before the last reset. Therefore, it was very, very easy to reestablish a civilization in this area where it was already existing, that already had the infrastructure that was capable of sustaining the population. And when you look at the fact that there were many different orphanages, asylums, all the institutions and structures that were required to support this mentality or this process of conflict, assimilation, indoctrination. The same process that we've seen repeated throughout all of our explorations. For example, look at this particular asylum, this octagonal building with its very impressive dome. How exactly could anyone actually explain or justify constructing a structure as elaborate and detailed as this, just for the sole purpose of being any sort of asylum? And of course, our official history tells us that asylums had a multitude of purposes in the 1800s. Yes, of course, we're well aware of how they were designated for the mentally ill at the time, but when you look at all the reasons, the official reasons for why one could be admitted to an asylum, it varies from everything of spousal difficulties to someone just simply not liking you, or maybe somebody just wants to get you out of the way and they could send you to an asylum. And that's not me being facetious. You can actually look up the reasons for people being committed to asylums, and you'll see that it includes everything. I wonder if there was a reason that said, conduct unbecoming a citizen of the United States. You know, that's kind of the catch-all that they have. And strangely enough, it survives in the parlance of the Uniform Code of Military Justice for the United States military. But looking at this particular octagonal asylum, why would anyone design an asylum with very windy staircases? And it even includes impressive columns. This is the prime example that we have of a structure that was apparently built for the purpose of housing people who had challenges with fitting in with society, people who we understand to be aberrations in terms of conforming to the rules of society. And yet for these people who have these challenges, we're going to give them a very complex structure that seems to be very difficult to get around. And I know the explanation will be, there were simply no safety standards. Nobody was thinking about safety. Safety is the answer to everything in our modern society and our civilization. And that may be true. Of course, another perspective will tell you that safety is merely the overall guiding reason given not to do something. Not to do really anything, because, it might be unsafe for me to even get out of my bed in the morning. Of course, you're not living your life, but, we don't need to have that discussion. But looking at these columns and these elaborate staircases and every bit of decoration, you really have to question what the original intention and purpose of this very elaborate structure originally was. And one of the surviving asylums, as it still stands to this day, it stands out in a way that really causes us to question the actual existence of this previous civilization. Because how could you really defend this during this time when you have a new nation, a new state, and what we're informed is a rapidly expanding city? It seemed to be, though, that New York City was designated from the very start of the United States to be the primary nexus point of the nation. And you could even argue that it's the primary nexus point of the entire world. The financial system is here. And whether we want to say that the financial system is merely an implement of control or it's just the means of facilitating our current civilization, was it different in previous civilizations? We really don't know. Official history tells us that there's always been money, and even before money there was the barter system, and there's really no other way to think about things. That may be true, or that might be highly questionable. But we can certainly see in the remnants and the ruins of these structures that, once again, they've gone through a process of renovation. And so, can we really take what we see at face value? It's one of the little details about New York City that I've always found most interesting about it, whatever I've visited in person, is actually trying, especially since I have the eyes that I have now, to deconflict what you see with the more modern structures and the legitimate old world structures. The number of small islands that are around Manhattan Island, such as Blackwell's Island, which is the location of this octagonal asylum that we just looked at. Why is it there were so many structures such as this in these facilities that are on these islands? I won't say anything about Rikers Island because I think we've already hit the nail on the head that, yes, when you enter this area, you're reminded that you're really entering a land of liberty. We won't say anything about the current percentage of incarcerated population of the United States. There's no need to. But was it all a design from the start? These asylums, this surviving infrastructure in New York City that's always been with us, that we have this port of entry, if you will. And when you look at this from a military perspective, anytime we understand military operations or a campaign, which the United States has the largest and most expeditionary capable military in the land today, you have to establish what's called a sea port of debarkation. And now, of course, in modern times with flying devices, planes, and so on and so forth, you also have an air port of debarkation. This is a main entry point. And is it possible that this entire city with its 5 boroughs was designated as Reset Center 1? That this was going to be the entry point for the entire United States? This infrastructure, these asylums that were so numerous, very well documented, very well recorded. You can look up the history of all the various asylums that they had across the 5 boroughs. And you can see that they had different designated purposes. We had orphan asylums. We had soldier asylums. We had asylums for virtually anything and everything else that you could think of. And every single one of these structures is massive, elaborately built, and seems to take up the area of an entire city block. And that's very impressive to me, especially considering how compressed and dense the plan was for the original city and how it passed over time. It's always been very densely populated. Of course, if you just go outside of New York City, you'll find that you have open land as far as the eye can see. And it's no coincidence that this particular area is featured and referenced in many times. I think of the movie Failsafe, where the accidental nuclear bombing of Moscow, and then in the plot of the movie, the president doesn't offer up Washington, D.C. to sacrifice, he offers up New York City, because it's the economic powerhouse of the United States. You would think it would be a national capital for a national capital. There's all the images that we have and the references of the entire orphan system, and I think about the orphan trains that originated from the city and its major port. It does make sense from that perspective, and it does support the official history. Yet when you take it along with the immigration coming through New York City, and the fact that all the adults and all the children all started at this nexus point, it supports the theory that this really was Reset Center 1. That the surviving populations, whether they were processed or whatever actually happened after the conflict, were brought in through this area and then facilitated to repopulate other areas where they had found surviving infrastructure, surviving cities. The other interesting thing is just how elaborate the surviving infrastructure of this particular area is. Recall that the population went from 500,000 to 8 million in a very short amount of time. And there's always that incredible story we have of the immense population growth by percentage in the United States. 1,000% from 1800 to 1900. And how were they able to construct all this impressive infrastructure, especially for water treatment? Water treatment facilities are something that we tend to overlook when we do our explorations, and you'll find no shortage of them across the 5 boroughs that show a very elaborate and old-world construction style behind them. And when I look at these many water treatment facilities across the area, I'm reminded of where we've seen them in other locations, such as the very impressive water towers of St. Louis that endure to this day. Ah yes, our finest masonry construction that was available in the 1800s. And you can see the detailing within this, these mixtures of blocks and bricks and unique coloring, and the fact that these structures all survive to this day. There's even the engineering achievement of the Croton Aqueduct. Ah yes, aqueducts. Something else that we got from the Romans. I always found it fascinating too that the Romans never actually went through any sort of industrial revolution, according to the official history, that they just had manual labor, and that's the answer for everything. Much like in the same way that we managed to pull off constructing all these impressive infrastructure establishments across not just New York, but the entire United States, was all done because we seemed to have infinite pools of labor. And it was easier because there were no safety standards. Now, of course, if you take the no safety standards to the opposite end of the spectrum, you realize that when you suddenly have a bunch of accidents in a particular work area and people are dying like flies, then no one's really going to want to work in that particular work area. It's going to have a reputation. The images that we have, though, paint an entirely different picture of this establishment of the infrastructure below the 5 boroughs. How exactly did they build this entire water system or this water purification system from scratch? We're informed officially that having resources is something that we still struggle with to this day, even with all of our modern technology, our excavation systems, and of course the advent of the computer. And at least I say anything about artificial intelligence, which is applicable in everything that we do now. But I look at these images and once again I have to question, is this an original construction? Or is this actually a salvage? In other words, they found all these facilities, albeit in a state of disrepair and damage from the previous reset event, and they had to be repaired. They had to be established and pressed back into service. And would that make a lot more sense with what we have with our current timeline? Of course, we don't really have any idea for what the timeline actually is, and I have no doubt that oftentimes it's one of the most deceived process, which is understanding our chronology. But you look at all the images, the actual photos, and the artwork of this impressive water treatment system that was required to care for this massive population. If you don't have water, then you can't have a city. It's relatively simple. I recall when I was still teaching medieval classes about how there were water carriers in the great cities of Europe. And I always found that very difficult to believe, even back then. Why would anybody lay out a city where you actually have to carry water miles just to provide people with water? It didn't really make a lot of sense. It's always very interesting to see these elaborate stones, these building blocks of these structures that are part of the water treatment system. Why would anybody go to the effort or the trouble of making this decorative at that point in time? You would expect these buildings to be as functional as possible, and yet certainly our modern buildings look a lot more functional than this does. I guess somebody was still so focused on artwork at the time that they decided to engage in this process that official history tells us is rustication, building a structure to automatically look old from the moment it was already constructed because it's more stylish. If you go around the entire 5 boroughs, you'll see signs of this water treatment system, this original aqueduct. And these stones are very, very impressive. Once again, I'm reminded of many other sites that we've seen across the land, such as the gigantic retaining wall that we've explored in Dubuque, Iowa. A retaining wall that no one really seems to know who originally constructed, and one that we certainly can't replicate today, or at least it would be prohibitively expensive. It's not because we can't do it, it's just because we lack the desire to do it, because, we have to minimize costs everywhere that we can. That is the end result of capitalism. But looking at these older water treatment plants and these centers for how this was carried out, we see signs of a much more advanced technology, a much greater capability. Certainly this is not a structure you would expect to see from the 1800s, designed to facilitate and treat water for the entire population of the city. And yet we have numerous images, numerous references to this very impressive system. And of course, all we have for the design is just, once again, a single perspective design. Now, it's not to say that there aren't other examples of it, potentially hiding in someone's basement or maybe even in someone's toilet, much like Urbano Monte's world map that was found in a toilet, because, where else would you find such things? But how exactly do you reconcile this capability of even constructing a structure like this? Something that doesn't really look like any sort of water treatment facility, but something that others might reference as a temple or a tomb, especially when we're talking about older civilizations, because every single structure for older civilizations seems to be labeled a temple or a tomb. I mean, you could very much easily label this impressive water treatment structure in New York City a temple or a tomb. Now, I know you're saying, why aren't you referring to the official name of it? Well, sometimes I try to refrain from referring to official names. You look at the images that we have of the construction of this impressive water treatment system. And I also am reminded of the underground system for the subway that was constructed in New York City. What kind of effort did this take? Once again, the official history tells us that the city was already there, but they had to dig out in between the streets to establish the subway. And no doubt in this image you see that they had to dig out and lay these gigantic pipes, these incredible systems with tremendous diameter to where you could fit several individuals shoulder to shoulder for this photo. How difficult would that have really been? And why isn't anybody doing that to this day? For that matter, why aren't we building water treatment structures like this today? Well, of course the answer will be it's not practicable. There's no real reason to do it. Why do we need to decorate it? And why do we want to bother making rusticated stone so it already looks old once we've constructed it? We can just easily build a very effective water treatment facility and not make it a castle-like structure. It only makes sense. It's very well documented that people might have had some strange pursuits in the past, and they might have put a little too much emphasis on artistry. Therefore, there's no need for any sort of creative structural designs to this day. But when you recall looking at our explorations of Niagara Falls and the surrounding area, we see the same thing. Think about what this effort really took. All of this dirt had to be excavated and removed. And every single one of these blocks or bricks or whatever the original construction materials were had to be placed in a very precise manner. There's also the fact that every single one of these details that we see are surviving to this day. In other words, this impressive infrastructure was built to last. Certainly not something that we have attributed to our current civilization. Now, maybe you think the container revival style is going to last a long time, and you know what, I could probably make the argument that yes, it will. If you buy a container revival style house, it's going to last longer than your modern siding houses that you'll see in the numerous subdivisions. Yes, the subdivisions, the only thing that we seem to construct to these days, but that's because it's more economically viable. Think about this particular image, for example. What kind of effort actually went into digging this out? And how was it done in the distant past? Where did all these materials come from, and how are they brought in, overcoming the logistical challenges? Or is it more possible that all of this had already been established by a previous civilization, and it simply needed to be cleaned up and repurposed? I always found this diagram very intriguing of an aqueduct from the times of Rome, yet somehow it looks a little bit more advanced and almost seems to be indicating an entirely different design. I know it's just a drawing and anybody could do a drawing, but something about it does seem to be a little bit more advanced and a little bit more impressive than we'd expect of what the Roman capabilities were at the time. And remember, the Romans never actually went through an industrial revolution of any sort, but they did somehow manage to contrive a concrete that is vastly superior to any of the concretes or cements that we officially have available to this day, or even in the recent past. The Reservoir of Manhattan, the waterworks. And here in this image from the very early 1800s, you can see that apparently we had the inclination to impose artistic stylings on our waterworks because, well, why wouldn't you build a great statue of Poseidon? Ah, yes, that infinite reference that we seem to have to deities, whether they be of Rome or Greece or any other pantheon of deities. And we always seem to want to integrate them within our structures. I mean, how would you know it's a water treatment plant if you didn't put some kind of godlike figure on top of it? And don't forget the columns. That's very important. Keep in mind, this was during the nascent phase of the United States when expansion was happening. Oh, and they were also building the Erie Canal. But, it stands to reason if they could pull off the Erie Canal in a very short amount of time, which involved extensive work. And don't forget, the official history tells us that the workers of the Erie Canal faced great difficulties. And the official history also says that people didn't like different groups of people. Yes, and yet despite all these challenges, despite all these logistical limitations, they were able to pull all this off. I know the answer will be because there was more money available in the past, there were no safety standards, and every single person who came from Europe was a master artisan and craftsman. Nobody was a logistician though, but remember, we can just assume that the logistics happened. And clearly they did. I mean, the structures are there. Some of the other images, though, that we have showing Manhattan Island do give an indication of this impressive architecture. Once again, why would someone build a water treatment plant that looks like this? Why is it so advanced? Oh, and here in this particular image, you can see that it's right next to a structure that looks like it belongs in some sort of World's Fair or some other sort of exposition. Because once again, no one's going to build a building like that. Someone told me in one of the comments that the reason that we went away from these dome structures or tore them down is because they're expensive to maintain. But once again, I always find it quite intriguing that we want to say that cost is a reason for why we don't do things anymore. And yet we have a system in place that allows us to continuously raise our debt ceiling every single year. So how can you say there's any sort of limitation to cost? Another one of these interesting artistic renderings that shows us the water treatment facility. And yet in the background, there seems to be no shortage of smokestacks. Is this some sort of representation, or was this actually a first-hand observer's artistic impression of what they really saw as the entire area of Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs was being repopulated, as it was being repaired and pressed back into service? Because you really have to step back and ask, what makes more sense? Because when you really look at the images of what remains to this day, you see structures that no one would build today. No one would build in the 1950s. Maybe someone would try it in the 1920s or the 1930s. I mean, yes, the 1920s, we say it was the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of economic prosperity, but the 1930s certainly weren't. But there's an explanation for that too, because the government had to put people to work, and therefore it had numerous programs to put people to work. But that's really the last time, at least in the United States, that you'll see any sort of reference to structures like this with what we're informed as masonry construction being built at a large level and across the entire land in many simultaneous projects at the same time. How much effort did this really take if this was done the way that we were told historically, where the city was already established? All the blocks were already planned out. There were people already living amongst this area when they had to dig out and establish this water treatment system, or to say nothing of the subway. And no, it's not just on the East Coast. You may recall our recent exploration when we looked at Omaha, and we saw that they inform us that they actually dug out the streets of Omaha. Well, people were living there, so they could level the grounds, so they could establish a sewage system, because apparently they didn't have one before. Very, very intriguing with all these conflicting accounts that we have. And now let's take a look at some images of New York from the 20th century, the 1900s. Ah, yes, our hanging policeman. I don't really understand this from the early 1900s. Is this just really to get into our face that there really were no safety standards and nobody had anything better to do than to just hang around? There is actually an explanation for this hanging policeman, and we'll get to it here in a moment, but why, if your conduct was law enforcement, would you be focused on doing something like this? Or was, it just kind of the concept of parlor tricks for the early 20th century and to get attention? Also, something else to think about. Here is a colorized version of that photograph. And I want you to really think about this. If a photo has color added later, or if it's altered in some way, is it still an original photograph? Is it still the original depiction of what actually happened? And don't forget that a photograph is just a photograph. You are seeing a representation of the event. You are not seeing the real event with your own eyes happen. It amazes me how often we tend to forget that because, we see so many photographs and we see so much video that we just accept everything we see at face value. And maybe that is the situation. Now, what's the story behind this police officer? Performs on the edge of space. It takes something strikingly unusual to startle the hundreds of thousands of people who rush along Broadway. Charles N. Fitzgerald, in command of the air police of that city, recently made multitudes gasp in amazement. And he would perform this way, doing these thrilling stunts by hanging off of girders and doing all sorts of parlor tricks and flips. Maybe he did cartwheels on the top of these girders, who knows? But did this really happen? I mean, certainly if a modern-day New York police officer attempted to do this, there would be all sorts of disciplinary issues. But back in the day, oh no, it was encouraged. The media even supported it. Flip around all you want to on your girders and show your physical capability. Now the article says that he did it to stay in shape for his job. Dedication back during that time. Looking at some of the images, though, especially from the early 20th century of New York, we can see that there are a multitude of old-world buildings that had many of these stylings and these architectural detailings within them that we've come to associate with the old world. There's no shortage of large blocks of domes and cupolas. Now, once again, people say, well, the issue was we had to tear them down because we couldn't maintain them. So if it was prohibitively expensive to maintain all these domes and these cupolas, how was it not prohibitively expensive to construct them in the first place? Was the economy really just that much better in the 1800s? And many of the construction images that we have are quite intriguing. And I'm oftentimes reminded of the most notorious example that we have of the Cathedral of Learning in Pennsylvania, where you see construction, and yet the layout of the interior doesn't match with the current present interior of the Cathedral of Learning. And I'm not even going to say anything about these counterbalance cranes, and maybe someone really needs to get around to actually patenting that human hamster wheel crane that we've always wanted to build. Now, we don't really have many working examples of it, but it is very well documented in artist pictures and renderings. We've explored many of the towers of New York, and we've seen that there is a variety of architectural stylings. Now, you would expect this to be very difficult, especially with the compression and the constraints that you have of a large existing city with a very large population. Remember, one that was already over 500,000 by the mid-1800s. But that didn't stop people from building these incredible structures with all these wonderful artistic touches on them. What exactly are these symbols and what do they really represent? I guess it was just the United States and New York City in the 1800s, and I don't need to ask any more questions. An image such as this, where you see this interesting variety in these structures. You see columns that are integrated into the walls. You see design decorations on the rooftops. You also see the very unique way that the structures seem to fit together. Now, a different perspective might indicate that this could have been a dystopian nightmare. And one of the things I've always said about the Old World, or Tartaria, the previous civilization, is that it certainly wasn't always any sort of balanced civilization. There is no doubt in my mind that it went through its dark days or its challenging time frames, just as everything seems to. And perhaps what we see with some of these structures that are very compressed and cramped together, that this is exactly what happened. So why was it that New York City became Reset Center 1? Simple. Because it seems to have had the most surviving infrastructure. It had systems that were already in place that with a minimal amount of effort at the time were able to be salvaged and brought back into service. And because of that, because of the existing natural harbor, whether we want to say it was natural or not, or have different theories on that, it facilitated the rapid redistribution of population to support the post-reset efforts. of imposing the process of conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. We look at the many images that we have that show a city that seems to give a completely different character than what we'd expect. And there's no shortage of images that show the presence of airships. There's also the fact that many of the structures, most famously the Empire State Building, seem to have been designed to facilitate a docking area for the airships. And don't forget the armories that we looked at earlier. That also seemed to have some sort of area that was designed for airship docking. And imagine if you had a transit system that wasn't just reliant on ground transportation, but was more reliant on air transportation. Then suddenly this vertical society of building these structures, these skyscrapers, makes a lot more sense. Because if you think about the limitations of the 1800s, why not just simply expand? Expand the boroughs. Keep expanding the city and utilizing the land that surrounds it. Continue to expand it on a two-dimensional plane. But that's not what we see that's happened in New York City. We see these skyscrapers that have been built to the very clouds. And we see many images of airships that seem to interface and dock with these skyscrapers. Is this just all an elaborate coincidence? There's also the presence of the fact that you do have the city that seems to have been built from the ground up to consider all these various transit systems. The fact that perhaps this being the surviving city of the previous civilization, it did have these transit systems that simply needed to be salvaged and pressed back into service. Now, it should be noted that there are accounts, especially in the 1890s, of the horse and buggies overwhelming Manhattan especially, that they had to be banned. Because what happens when you have tens of thousands of horses in a very cramped urban area? Well, the horses have to defecate, and before too long you have a lot of horse poop. As someone who's worked with horses, I can attest to that. One of the things you're doing is you're mucking stalls or mucking the areas where horses have operated, and that's simply scooping up the poop to make it viable to continue operations. Isn't this an interesting image? There's all the different futuristic inclinations that we've had that are associated with New York. And, as I said, the fact that it appears in many different prominent factors. When we consider our exploration earlier of Soylent Green, it of course was set in New York. And where does this terminology Empire City and the Empire State come from? Were they originally intending New York to be some sort of new empire? Or is it some sort of reference that merely survived in the vernacular at the time? Hard to say. Yes, I know we have our official historical account because somehow we always seem to know the exact origin of every sobriquet that we use, whether it's for a city or a person. And here you can see it in this image, all these horses and buggies that were operational at that time. Of course, now if you're going to use a horse and buggy in New York, it's considered a novelty, or it's something that you can see and enjoy in The Muppets Take Manhattan. But looking at some of the older images, you again have the impression of more advanced architecture. You see elements of someone who had the capability to lay out structures in different formats, with what we're informed are different architectural stylings. Once again, I'm amazed at all the different architectural movements that we had from the 1800s to the early 1900s, and that just seemed to all go away. And who knows, maybe there actually is a mainstream explanation that makes total sense. It's the same reason for why we don't do original intellectual properties in our entertainment today. It's just easier to do what's already been done before, and really that's all anybody wants to see. So, we've got to give people what they want. Why try anything new or establish any sort of originality? Some of these victory arches are always very intriguing, and when you look at some of the varied images, it's amazing to think that New York appears in many different identifications. In some images, it appears as though it's some kind of futuristic science fiction city. In others, it seems to be some sort of amalgamation, a combination of an older city and yet with many newer structures. Even to this day, if you walk the skyscrapers or you get down on ground zero and walk around and look at all the old world structures, you might play a little game with yourself to try to identify when the structure was originally constructed. And then, of course, actually trying to determine when all the renovations were done on each of these structures. The harbor, though, seems to be the main answer. And let's also not forget that there's a lot of points of interest that are in very close geographical proximity to the Great Harbor of New York. For example, Coney Island, which we explored and has its own reputation of being the display of the incubator babies. Again, another coincidence. The fact that the orphan trains were facilitated through New York City. And, of course, the official history says that's because of the society at that time. There were a lot of people who were having children out of wedlock, and that's why there were so many orphans at that time. At least that's what we understand it to be. But looking at structures such as this, with the cupola and the domes, and even on smaller structures, you have to really consider the effort that had to go into this construction. And how exactly would one really go about deconflicting all this with the other structures? We have numerous accounts of buildings that only lasted for a few years, and yet they were very elaborate structures, certainly not buildings that we build to this day, such as the Gelander building that didn't really last that long and was quickly torn down and replaced by many other buildings. Now, these are just the main buildings that we're aware of. How many structures do we really have in New York that we don't actually keep tabs on or don't really have a historical account to them? Yes, I know there are people out there that'll tell you there's everything in public records. Nothing's ever lost in public records, even though there's incessant examples of many things being lost or missing from public records. But sure, we can put our faith in public records. I'm just asking, how many structures do we really have that we don't have the official history behind? Now, yes, I know there'll be explanations behind it. The records were lost in a fire, somebody flushed them down the toilet, they were ripped up during a mouse chase, and we just don't have them anymore. But I think the most interesting thing about this city is looking at the ways in which it's changed, but also comparing that with the ways that it's stayed the same. Because how many flat iron structures are there across the land? What other cities have we seen this particular structure style that we thought was only unique to New York City? But where else has it appeared? I'll give you a hint, there's a very prominent southern city where this exact same structure appears. But maybe that was just the structure that we wanted to go with at that time. Or maybe, just maybe, it's a surviving example of a civilization that made maximum use and had the capability to do so of the land that they were constructing the buildings on. Why do we have so many images that show the trolley in a completely different infrastructure and transit capability? Because it's not just about moving people, it's also about moving materials. And if you really think about it, you have to have a much more extensive transit capability, one that involves land, sea, and air, if you're really going to pull off something like this compressed urban area. There's also the mentality that comes around with it. For example, looking at this particular structure, and once again we have a little dome with a cupola on top of it. Why would anybody ever bother with that in the official history? Why would anybody go to that effort to do that? And I'm also amazed by some of the images that we see that show more advanced trains and trolleys than we'd expect to see. I know it was well documented at that time that we were trying many different designs, and during that time frame we had a focus on creative artistic impressions. And look, just because we live in a current civilization that doesn't value that just wants to do derivative redos, reimaginings, and retakes of everything, there's no reason to question things that in the past there was a different civilization that really had the ability to create and innovate. You know, we love to say those words, we love to say that we innovate, but how much do we really innovate? For example, these images that we have of this great apocalypse of horse feces that was all over Manhattan Island. Strangely enough, this was only a problem in the 1890s, and also odd that you don't hear this being a problem in other cities. Now the explanation will be because everybody was looking to have their high society in New York, and keep in mind this is also the most valuable land, especially when you're talking about the areas of downtown Manhattan, Fifth Avenue, and so on and so forth. You have very wealthy people who were using their horse and buggies, and it created an apocalyptic mess of horse manure that had to be cleared very quickly. And yet it's rather odd that this wasn't a problem in other cities, at least it's not referred to, or other towns, because exclusively at that time, we were reliant on horse and buggy for immediate transportation. It's not like you could jump on the train and it would take you all the way back to your house, or take you from the opera houses or Broadway that everybody was going to at that time and going back to your residence or your flat, which, by the way, was also in another built-up structure. How exactly did they clear up this problem? And I think of the many TED Talks that we have that talked about this environmental disaster, and yet it only seemed to occur in one particular area. So what to make of it? It's very difficult. Ah, yes, the World Building in New York. One of my favorite old world structures. A skyscraper that actually had a dome, almost looking like it's from a state capitol, built on top of it. It even has a pediment. And once again, I'm asking the question, why don't we build like this anymore? Why don't we go to the effort to build skyscrapers that have this kind of artistic impression in them? Do we just lack the capability? Why wouldn't we want to do this? It's too expensive to maintain the dome, but it's certainly not too expensive to continue to support regional wars anywhere and everywhere that they happen. And it's most certainly not too expensive to continuously raise the debt ceiling every single year. So I'm really not buying the argument that we just don't have the financial capability to do this. And remember, New York City is the home of the most billionaires and millionaires in the land. So really, how do we not have the money to do these things? Well, you know what they say. Money can allow you to do anything just so long as you're supposed to do it. Now, looking at some of these other images, you can see again the impressive buildings in the background and the variations of construction. And it really gives us the overall hint that we're actually looking at different eras from a past civilization. That's what I believe that we see when we look at the genuine old world structures of New York, and that's what makes it so incredibly interesting. Now we can accept the fact that our mainstream history tells us that we managed to pull off all these incredible feats, and that during the 1800s we could really achieve anything. We could build a nation where there had been no nation. We could build cities and courthouses and state capitals all in a short amount of time. We could build an entire infrastructure where none had existed. And again, I ask you the question, how many towns and cities did we build from the ground up after 1940? Does it compare with the number of towns and cities that we built from the ground up in the 1800s? Just looking at the United States. Yes, I know, the European example is a little bit more difficult because there is a longer written history. But is that to say that there's truly a different background for what really happened? Looking at some of these impressive structures, though, you get the idea of grand palaces and grand forums, something that, if we were looking at an ancient civilization, we'd be told these are all tombs and temples. This is not a transit station. This is a municipal building. Ah, yes, and one of my favorite Art Deco buildings in the background there. And in our explorations of New York City, we've seen that there are some of the most interesting and unique, varied architectural examples. And there's always that competition that was going on between Chicago and New York at that time. Ah, yes, the lovely Federal Hall and the lovely New York Stock Exchange and all the other intricate buildings that, once again, don't seem to reflect a very what we'd think of as American nature with a lot of these structures. For some reason, I'm almost thinking that we're looking at some remnant of Rome here. Why is it we always have these pediments in these columns? Well, because everybody wants to be like Rome. Rome was just incredibly cool in so many different ways, shapes, and forms. And that's why you had structures like this. How exactly was this originally constructed and laid out? What techniques were used to really achieve all of this? Oh, look. Yes, it's the location where Solidus Snake finally died after he fell off the top. But every single time I look at these different structures, especially the unique rooftops and the different walls and supporting beams, and every single decoration that somebody went to the effort of putting on them, you have to really ask the question, how much time and effort would it have really taken? Is it really possible that every single artistic detailing, even on this one structure, which is just one smaller building in a greater metropolitan area, was done and pulled off in the 1800s? Well, yes, because everybody was an artisan and craftsman. Of course, that's why that's the only explanation for why we have these impressive structures. How else are you going to explain it? How else are you going to say that, yes, it was because there were people who were just such hard workers and there were no safety standards? That's exactly how this was done. And it's intriguing that that's the explanation for everything. It's also the explanation for how Rome was able to achieve its architectural incredible monstrosities, or however you want to phrase them, because they had infinite labor and they had no safety standards. And if you just have labor, you can take care of everything. Well, of course. And apparently when you have forced labor, you don't have to feed it. You don't have to provide it water. You don't have to care for it, do you? The other thing that we often overlook are the incredible port facilities. The port facilities that, once again, seem to be very well constructed and have something a little bit more complicated than what we'd expect to see at that time. You would expect to see perhaps some very large and extensive two-dimensional wooden structures. But once again, that's not the case. Once again, we have very elaborate facilities that seem to be some sort of either advanced masonry construction, as they say at the time, or perhaps it involved some sort of advanced cement. Was it Rossendale? Was it Portland? Or was it Roman concrete? Or was it something else entirely? I'm always amazed by the fact of how much we take things at face value. And looking at even the nature of the very streets itself, the cobblestone streets or the brick streets, and that's the ones that were covered in horse feces that had to be cleared, or were the victim of many blizzards during the odd weather events that seemed to occur in the 1800s. So really, we've had everything here that's transpired in these 5 boroughs in Manhattan Island. So overall, what are your thoughts on New York City being reset Center 1? Is it possible that this, in fact, was the surviving infrastructure along with the supporting system, and that's why we have all of these impressive structures? Why this was purposed with the current civilization to be the main nexus point? And you can even make the argument that this particular area continues to survive as the main nexus point for this current civilization. The United Nations is headquartered in this area. We have so many different civilizations and societies that overlap in this particular area. And whether that's going with the alternative theory of there being other civilizations in the more immediate past that we're not aware of, or just simply the existence of different societies that we can see by the different spoken languages. Over 800 official languages that are spoken within this city. And if you travel it today, you will certainly see that's the case. There are many different cultures that are represented here. And was that always by design? Was this always supposed to be the area that we have our main facilitation point, our seaport of debarkation, our main point for resetting an entire civilization, for facilitating the process of conflict, assimilation, indoctrination? All the immigrants to the United States came through New York City. All of the orphans originated in New York City, or they were brought there. There's also so many different examples of the impressive architecture of the past. Columns, pillars, pediments, and obelisks even, along with the great triumph arches that we have. Everything seen in one particular geographical area. Is that because it really was a city that did happen to develop in the way that we understand with the official historical account? Or is it because of the fact that it's actually one of the most intact surviving examples of an entire old world urban area? One that continues to endure to this day. And whether you're looking at the older images of New York or you're actually just walking through the streets present day, I suggest that you take a look and pay attention to all the different symbols, all the different representations that you see, and really try to understand, try to deconflict your understanding, especially your official historical understanding, of the development of this impressive city over time, and even the very identity of the United States itself. Do the symbols that you see, do the representation that you see in each of these structures actually reflect what your understanding is? And also understand the fact that here in the 21st century, we've seen the development and the establishment of these great pencil skyscrapers, something that from a distance tends to draw your attention. And if you think about that, is that another means of obscuring or hiding what remains of the old world in plain sight? Because our eyes will always be drawn to the shiny skyscrapers. And even though when we actually pay attention to the detail, they don't possess the detail that are in the old world structures. They don't have all the incredible artistic renderings that we have. The faces, the designs, the leaf motifs, and all the other symbols that we don't seem to know exactly what they stand for, that are present in every single structure that are across the land, and every single legitimate old world structure that still exists in the great city to this day. Why don't we build flat iron buildings anymore? Well, we just don't have the desire to do it. But as always, I leave it to you. Let me know in the comments. What do you think? Did this city develop just as we're told it did historically? Or does this theory of this area being reset center 1 actually hold weight? And if you live in the city, I suggest you walk around and pay attention to where you still see the examples of surviving old world architecture. You might be surprised to know that it is a lot more prominent and a lot more present than you like to believe, once you look past the beautiful, shiny skyscrapers and the newer ones that we've been establishing. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.